Questi che vediamo. Il Papa legge sul loro volto l'angoscia. Osserviamo, stringe le mani. Ecco la bambina.
What if behind the missing posters and media campaigns lies a hidden network, one bound not by chance, but by ritual, silence, and power? Red Shoe Club has long been whispered about in the darkest corners of conspiracy linked to elites, coded symbols, and the unexplained disappearances of children. Could Madeleine McCann's case be more than a tragedy? Could it be a carefully masked transaction, one with threads leading to places the public was never meant to look? The truth may be hidden in plain sight, beneath polished shoes and polite lies. In 2008, a set of e-fit images released to the public stirred intense controversy and debate within the ongoing investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. These computer-generated composite sketches, produced from the recollections of Irish witness Martin Smith and his family, depicted a man seen carrying a child in the Praia da Luz area of Portugal on the night Madeleine vanished. What followed would become one of the most polarizing and widely circulated topics within internet forums and alternative investigative communities. Some observers began pointing out a striking resemblance between the two e-fits and the well-known political operatives Tony and John PODESTA. The comparison, which first gained momentum on websites, centered around facial structure, hairline, and other facial features. These claims, though unverified, gained viral traction, particularly after a private investigative firm, Oakley International, included the e-fits in materials used in a documentary regarding the McCann case. While no official identification was ever made by UK or Portuguese authorities linking the PODESTAs to the e-fits, the speculation has continued to fuel online discussions and suspicion. The lack of formal denial or confirmation by law enforcement left a vacuum easily filled by alternative theories. Central to these theories is the idea that the McCann investigation may have crossed paths with individuals far more powerful than anyone dared to confront directly. Critics argue that while the resemblance may be coincidental, the sheer scale of the case and the political pressure surrounding it meant that even leads with potential were quietly brushed aside. Further amplifying these theories was a claim that Tony and John PODESTA were actually present in Portugal in May 2007, during the exact time frame of Madeleine McCann's disappearance. The PODESTA brothers were allegedly staying at a friend's house near the Ocean Club resort in Praia da Luz. However, no official travel records, surveillance footage, or third-party confirmations have ever substantiated this claim. The assertion remains a cornerstone of conspiracy theory literature, frequently cited without documentation or source validation. The strength of this claim relies heavily on its circumstantial value and suggestive narrative logic rather than concrete forensic evidence. No airline manifests, border control entries, or passport data have linked either PODESTA brother to Portugal during that period. Yet, the theory has endured largely due to its compelling psychological pull, the need to find a scapegoat or a symbolic villain in a case mired in obfuscation and unanswered questions. Another layer of intrigue comes from the alleged connection between Jerry McCann and an underground network referred to as the Red Shoe Club. Some online communities claim that both Jerry McCann and Tony PODESTA were members of this alleged group. The Red Shoe Club is often described within these circles as a secretive society engaged in occult rituals and child exploitation, its symbolic red shoes supposedly a nod to such clandestine activity. Yet again, these claims have never been backed by any law enforcement body or reputable investigative outlet. There is no legally recognized organization by that name, nor is there credible evidence to suggest that such a group ever existed beyond digital myth-making. Still, the idea has flourished, feeding into a broader ecosystem of conspiracy narratives that blend real-world tragedy with fantastical layers of hidden evil. Possibly the most well-known and controversial aspect of the PODESTA McCann theory is its intersection with the Pizzagate conspiracy. As detailed in the same source document, some individuals claim to have reviewed leaked emails from John Podesta which referenced cheese pizza at odd hours of the day, specifically 3 p.m. The phrase, cheese pizza, has been alleged in Pizzagate lore to be a code word for child filth. These interpretations stem from a hyper-literal and speculative reading of emails released during the WikiLeaks dump of the Podesta email account. The FBI, in its public statements, has consistently denied the validity of such interpretations and has found no evidence of a child trafficking ring linked to those communications. Furthermore, many journalists and investigators have debunked the linguistic code theory, pointing out that the referenced emails have banal, innocent contexts when read in full. Still, the emotional and visual strength of such language persists, particularly when tied to high-profile individuals and unresolved cases like Madeleine McCann's. The combination of fits resembling controversial political figures, unsubstantiated rumors of physical presence, associations with secretive groups, and interpretations of leaked emails creates a web of suspicion that is difficult to dismantle once embedded in the public consciousness. So the question remains, are these just chilling coincidences, the result of overzealous internet sleuths and confirmation bias? Or are they subtle threads pointing to a much larger narrative that was deliberately ignored or suppressed? The enduring power of this theory does not lie in what it proves, but in what it suggests, that powerful people may be above scrutiny, and that systems designed to protect the innocent may falter when confronted with influence and secrecy. Whether or not the Podestas had any connection to the McCann case, their insertion into the narrative serves as a cautionary tale about the gaps that open when public trust erodes and transparency fails. In the end, the Madeleine McCann case remains one of the most haunting unsolved disappearances in modern history. The involvement of the Podesta brothers, as widely circulated online, may be entirely unfounded. Yet the fact that such a theory gained immense traction reveals how desperately the world wants answers, and how, in the absence of closure, even the most improbable connections can feel plausible when viewed through the lens of collective doubt. One of the most unsettling and controversial theories in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann is the possibility that she was not kidnapped by an intruder, but rather handed over or sold through a premeditated arrangement. This theory, while lacking formal evidence, is based on a series of behavioral, spatial, and contextual anomalies that challenge the official narrative. At the heart of this argument are disturbing implications, not only about who took Madeleine, but about who may have allowed it to happen. To begin with, the placement of Madeleine's bed within the holiday apartment raises immediate red flags. According to multiple reports and photographs, Madeleine was sleeping in the bed nearest the door, farthest from the window. In contrast, her two younger twin siblings were sleeping in cribs closer to the far wall. From a purely practical standpoint, if an intruder had truly broken into the apartment with the goal of abducting a child, logic suggests they would have chosen the easiest, quietest option, one of the twins. Infants are smaller, easier to carry, and less likely to awaken or resist. Instead, the alleged abductor bypassed the twins and selected the older, more vocal child, located closest to the exit. This behavior undermines the idea of a spontaneous break-in. It suggests intent and familiarity. Madeleine's position near the door becomes, in this context, a detail that strengthens the theory that her removal from the apartment was not random but orchestrated. Adding to this suspicion is the complete disregard for the twins. If a criminal had risked entering the apartment and had time to select a child, why not take both twins? Or all three children? That only Madeleine was taken points to the possibility that she, and only she, was the objective. In profiling terms, the target selection appears specific rather than opportunistic. In fact, this targeted choice aligns more closely with human trafficking behavior, where specific physical or psychological traits are sought by buyers. This unsettling line of thinking finds further support in a claim made by a staff member at the Ocean Club Resort. The employee recalled overhearing a peculiar conversation between Jerry and Kate McCann. Within that exchange, words such as vulnerable, cute, and superior were reportedly used. These descriptors, when applied to a child, deviate from the natural language of parental affection. Rather than expressions of love or concern, the terms sounded oddly categorical, as though evaluating qualities. In the world of child exploitation and illicit adoption, such terminology is disturbingly familiar. It denotes valuation, as one would describe a product or asset. While this observation has not been officially investigated, it contributes to the broader suspicion that Madeleine may have been intentionally selected, even marketed. Equally disconcerting is the way Kate and Jerry McCann often referred to Madeleine in interviews and public appearances. Multiple independent observers and analysts have pointed out the detached, objectifying tone in their statements. Madeleine is frequently described in passive or possession-like terms, or daughter, or the child, with minimal emotional texture. While grief manifests in varied and complex ways, linguistic forensics has long studied speech patterns as indicators of guilt, concealment, or emotional dissociation. In high-stakes cases, particularly involving close family members, emotional suppression is not uncommon. However, when paired with inconsistencies and peculiar language use, such patterns merit deeper scrutiny. They suggest a psychological distancing that could be indicative of unresolved guilt or trauma, or worse, deliberate detachment. Perhaps the most shocking claim is, Kate and Jerry sold Maddie to the PODESTAs for £5 million. This is, undeniably, a bold and inflammatory accusation. It is not backed by financial records, witness testimony, or investigative confirmation. However, its inclusion in underground narratives highlights a critical aspect of public distrust in the case. Why would anyone believe such a claim? Because over time, the official investigation has left gaps, holes in timelines, overlooked evidence, and inexplicable decisions by law enforcement. When these gaps remain unfilled, the public instinctively fills them, often with suspicion. The £5 million figure has no confirmed origin, but its repetition across multiple conspiracy theories signals a belief that some kind of high-stakes transaction took place. From a behavioral standpoint, the aftermath of the disappearance also raises questions. Rather than retreating from the spotlight, the McCanns launched a massive global media campaign, raised millions in donations, and participated in interviews and documentaries. While this could be interpreted as a sincere quest for justice, others view it as a public relations strategy designed to redirect suspicion and control the narrative. Then there's the physical evidence, or lack thereof. No signs of forced entry were found in apartment 5A. The shutters showed no evidence of tampering. The only opening available was the patio door, which was often left unlocked. This detail, combined with the strategic placement of Madeleine's bed, implies access without conflict. Moreover, the cadaver dog and blood detection dog, brought into the apartment months later, both alerted in several key locations, including behind the couch and inside the McCann's rental car. These findings, while not definitive proof, are consistent with post-mortem concealment and transport. Yet rather than pushing further, the investigation retreated. The narrative was reshaped to emphasize an outside abduction, despite internal evidence contradicting that storyline. This lack of coherence lends weight to the theory that what occurred in apartment 5A was not a crime of opportunity, but an act carefully managed to appear as such. Taken together, these factors form a compelling pattern. A child disappears without a trace. No forced entry. No cries for help. A sibling is chosen while others are ignored. Language that distances rather than grieves. Witness reports of marketing-like descriptions. Behavioral anomalies. And the ever-lingering question of money and influence. So we must ask, was Madeleine McCann the victim of a tragic, opportunistic kidnapping, or was she part of a transaction far more sinister? If this was a sale disguised as a disappearance, who facilitated it? Who received her? And why has no authority dared to explore this path with the seriousness it demands? These are questions without comfortable answers. But in a case where comfort has long been the enemy of truth, perhaps it is time to reconsider what we think we know, and who benefits from us never knowing more. In the history of modern criminal investigations, few cases have generated as much global attention and as much suspicion as the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. While the mystery of what happened to the 3-year-old girl in Praia da Luz, Portugal, continues to confound the public, one question remains especially persistent: why have Kate and Jerry McCann, her parents, received such extraordinary support from the highest levels of political and media institutions? Was this simply the result of public sympathy and a global sense of injustice? Or does it suggest a deeper, more calculated effort to protect interests far beyond a missing child? One of the earliest indicators that the case would be treated with exceptional sensitivity came from the involvement of 2 British Prime Ministers, Gordon Brown and David Cameron. This is a highly unusual precedent. Heads of government rarely intervene in individual criminal matters abroad, particularly those lacking an obvious diplomatic dimension. Yet in 2007, shortly after Madeleine disappeared, then Chancellor of the Exchequer Gordon Brown, who would become Prime Minister shortly thereafter, made personal contact with Portuguese authorities, reportedly after complaints from the McCann family that local investigators were not cooperating or providing enough support. His involvement raised eyebrows not just in Portugal, but in legal communities across Europe. Why would a soon-to-be British Prime Minister feel compelled to step into a foreign criminal investigation of a private citizen? Later, in 2011, David Cameron authorized the launch of Operation Grange, an official review and reinvestigation of the case by Scotland Yard. This came after a direct appeal from the McCanns, which was accompanied by a highly publicized open letter in a British tabloid. Cameron responded quickly and decisively, green-lighting a taxpayer-funded operation with a declared budget that eventually exceeded $13 million. Such attention from political leadership is, in itself, enough to fuel speculation. Critics pointed out that in countless other child abduction cases, grieving families struggle for years to have their cases reopened or even properly investigated. So why did the McCanns receive nearly immediate and sustained support at the highest levels of the UK government? Was it merely the result of an effective media campaign, or was there something, or someone, the government wished to protect? Operation Grange itself, launched under the premise of starting from scratch, quickly drew criticism from independent investigators and observers. Despite initial claims of objectivity, the operation reportedly focused almost exclusively on the abduction hypothesis. From the beginning, police statements and press briefings emphasized the likelihood of an external abductor and downplayed alternative theories, particularly those involving potential family complicity or accidental death, followed by a cover-up. This focus stood in contrast to evidence presented in the original Portuguese police files. These included the reactions of 2 specialized British sniffer dogs, one trained to detect cadaver scent, and another trained to identify blood traces. Both dogs alerted in key locations inside apartment 50A, behind the couch, and in the trunk of the rental car used by the McCanns. There were also inconclusive but noteworthy DNA findings, inconsistencies in witness statements, and behavioral patterns that raised red flags for criminal profilers. Yet, despite these factors, Operation Grange appeared to steer away from exploring any scenario that implicated the parents. This decision gave rise to a troubling theory: that Operation Grange was less a search for the truth and more a mechanism of damage control. By keeping the investigation confined to the narrative of a kidnapping, the operation may have served to contain the scope of inquiry and prevent potentially embarrassing revelations. Whether this was done out of sympathy, political pressure, or deeper institutional concerns remains unclear, but the effect was the same: narrowing the investigation to a singular, and arguably least likely, path. Meanwhile, the British press took on a surprisingly uniform tone in its coverage of the McCanns. Major outlets regularly framed the couple as victims rather than potential suspects, even after they were declared arguidos as or formal suspects by Portuguese police in 2007. Critical coverage was rare and often discredited as insensitive or conspiratorial. When Portuguese detective Goncalo Amaral published his book The Truth of the Lie, which detailed his belief that Madeleine had died in the apartment and that her parents were involved in concealing the truth. He was sued by the McCanns for defamation. The British media overwhelmingly sided with the family and painted Amaral as vengeful or incompetent. Internationally, the picture was more varied. Media outlets in Portugal and Germany were far more willing to entertain alternative theories. German police would later assert in 2020 that they believed Madeleine was dead and had identified a new suspect. Yet within the UK, media narratives continued to adhere closely to the framework established by Operation Grange and shaped by the McCann legal and PR team. All of this feeds into a larger and more unsettling hypothesis, that Madeleine was not simply a missing child, but the victim of a larger, more complex network, perhaps involving human trafficking, illicit adoption, or even elite exploitation. Her disappearance may have intersected with powerful individuals or organizations, such as the so-called Red Shoe Club, or public figures like the PODESTA brothers or José Manuel Barroso. While these names are often invoked without credible proof, the consistency and scale of these narratives reflect a deep public skepticism toward official explanations. In this framework, the protection afforded to the McCanns makes sense, not because they were guilty of wrongdoing necessarily, but because any deeper investigation risked exposing connections too damaging to pursue. If Madeleine's disappearance was part of a larger pattern of abuse, trafficking, or ritual exploitation, no matter how improbable that may sound, then opening that door fully would demand an accountability that institutions may not be prepared to offer. Finally, and perhaps most tellingly, is the fact that despite strong leads, forensic anomalies, and extensive investigation, no one has been charged. The case has consumed millions of pounds, mobilized top investigators, and spanned nearly 2 decades, and yet remains technically unsolved. In most criminal cases, the absence of resolution is due to lack of leads or evidence. But in this case, the lingering sense is different, that the case remains unsolved not because there is too little evidence, but because there is too much, pointing in directions too politically dangerous to follow. In the end, the question is not just what happened to Madeleine McCann, but what forces ensured that certain answers would never be publicly accepted. Was the protection around the McCanns an outpouring of national empathy, or a carefully orchestrated firewall designed to prevent the collapse of a narrative that too many powerful interests depend on? Until that question is allowed to be asked openly by investigators, journalists, and the public alike, the truth behind Madeleine McCann's disappearance may remain forever out of reach. From the very beginning of the Madeleine McCann case, one of the most perplexing and often scrutinized aspects has been the public demeanor and verbal responses of her parents, Kate and Gerry McCann. While it is not uncommon for parents of missing children to appear emotionally subdued or controlled, especially under intense media pressure, the degree of verbal distancing and apparent emotional detachment observed in their interviews has given rise to ongoing psychological analysis. In particular, their repeated use of evasive phrases, refusal to answer questions during official investigations, and inconsistencies in behavior have created a portrait of parents who may be hiding something behind the veil of grief. During interviews with both the media and law enforcement, the McCanns frequently relied on a narrow set of vague or deflective responses. Phrases such as, "I don't know," "not to my knowledge," and "I don't recall," were repeated so consistently that analysts began to take note. While these responses are not inherently suspicious, especially in a high-stress environment, their repetition becomes problematic when used to avoid acknowledging factual, verifiable actions. This pattern was particularly evident in questions related to the timeline of Madeleine's disappearance, the frequency and method of child checks during the evening, and the behavior of the other adults present the so-called TAPAS 7. Instead of providing clarity or certainty, Gerry and Kate's replies often lacked specificity or were simply noncommittal. From the perspective of forensic linguistics, this is known as psychological distancing, a deliberate or subconscious tactic used to create emotional and cognitive space between the speaker and the event. According to experts in statement analysis, such as Peter Hyatt and Mark McClish, such linguistic habits can signal an internal conflict, perhaps even guilt. When someone is telling the truth about a traumatic event, their language tends to be grounded in sensory detail, time, and emotion. In contrast, vague, depersonalized, or passive constructions are more likely when someone is concealing facts or trying to detach themselves from uncomfortable realities. One of the most glaring examples of this distancing came during Kate McCann's formal police interrogation in 2007. At that time, she was asked 49 direct questions by Portuguese investigators regarding her activities, observations, and decisions on the night Madeleine vanished. Astonishingly, Kate refused to answer 48 of those 49 questions. The only query she responded to was one inviting her to add anything she wished to the record. The unanswered questions included crucial details, such as did Madeleine ever wake up during the night and cry? Did you clean or move anything in the apartment? Do you believe Madeleine died in the apartment? These are not speculative or accusatory questions, they are fundamental queries in any investigation of a missing child. While Kate had every legal right to remain silent, the scale and uniformity of her refusal raised serious concerns, even among neutral observers. It suggested not only a fear of self-incrimination, but perhaps a knowledge of events that she felt unable or unwilling to verbalize. Equally puzzling was the behavior of Jerry McCann on the morning after Madeleine's disappearance. A local Portuguese man named Paulo Nido claimed to have seen Jerry and Kate walking alone in Praia da Luz around 7 a.m. on May 4, 2007, just hours after the child had allegedly been abducted. What made this sighting unusual was the absence of any police escort or protective presence. For two parents whose daughter had just been kidnapped, walking unaccompanied through a foreign town, without visible distress or urgency, struck many as incongruent with their circumstances. More troubling still is that this moment was never mentioned in the 2007 police reports or media coverage. It did not surface until Kate's memoir was published in 2011, where it was presented in a way that seemed curated rather than spontaneous. This delayed disclosure led to questions. Was this moment deliberately withheld in the early stages of investigation? If so, why? And if it was truly innocent, why wasn't it mentioned earlier, when such details could have been crucial? Another instance that caught the public's attention was Jerry McCann's televised embrace with Robert Murat, a British-Portuguese man who had been previously named as an arguido aos official suspect by Portuguese police. In a later press conference, Jerry was filmed hugging Murat despite Murat having been placed under immense pressure and suspicion earlier in the investigation. Analysts described the embrace as awkward, overly staged, and emotionally hollow. The gesture appeared not as a reconciliation between two wrongly accused men, but as a calculated effort to demonstrate unity and closure. Critics argue that rather than being an expression of personal solidarity, the hug was a media maneuver designed to shift the narrative. It sent a visual signal that the McCanns were beyond suspicion and even capable of forgiving others who had suffered because of the investigation. But to many viewers, the display felt artificial, an act of damage control rather than a spontaneous, human moment. Taken collectively, these behaviors and verbal patterns begin to form a disturbing picture. While they cannot serve as legal evidence of wrongdoing, they are psychologically and behaviorally inconsistent with the expected reactions of bereaved parents in such a catastrophic situation. The McCanns' repeated lack of emotional authenticity, described by observers as crying without tears or speaking without trembling voices, has been noted by both professionals and laypeople alike. In multiple interviews, Jerry and Kate referred to Madeleine in oddly passive terms, often using the child or our daughter instead of her name. This is another red flag in statement analysis, as people who are deeply connected to the victim typically use their name often, especially when recalling specific memories. Furthermore, they often reversed the order of events when describing the timeline or introduced irrelevant details that disrupted logical flow. These patterns align with deception indicators in forensic linguistics. Of course, it's important to recognize that trauma affects individuals differently. Post-traumatic stress, guilt, and emotional shock can all manifest in seemingly unnatural ways. People grieving a sudden loss are not always coherent, emotional, or even logical. But when these inconsistencies align with repeated deflections, refusals to engage with investigators, and public displays that feel more managed than sincere, the doubt grows. Ultimately, these psychological clues do not provide concrete answers about what happened to Madeleine McCann, but they raise unsettling possibilities about what was left unsaid, what was intentionally obscured, and who may be protecting themselves more than seeking truth. Was the McCann's media-friendly persona a coping mechanism or a calculated shield? Are these linguistic and behavioral red flags the result of stress and media fatigue, or signs that the couple knows far more than they've ever admitted? Until those questions can be examined openly, without media bias, legal barriers, or political interference, the full story behind Madeleine's disappearance may remain hidden in plain sight. In the labyrinth of contradictions that define the Madeleine McCann investigation, few aspects are as telling or as quietly dismissed as the work of the British cadaver and blood detection dogs deployed months after her disappearance. Though their reactions were unambiguous, consistent, and deeply alarming, the value of their findings was ultimately minimized. This selective recognition speaks volumes not only about the trajectory of the investigation, but about the mechanisms of narrative control in high-profile cases. Two highly trained dogs, Eddie and Keela, were brought into apartment 5A where Madeleine was last seen. Eddie, a cadaver dog, is trained to detect the scent of human decomposition. Keela, a blood detection dog, specializes in finding minute traces of blood, even when attempts have been made to clean them. Both dogs gave alerts in key areas within the apartment behind the living room sofa and in the room believed to be Madeleine's. Additionally, they signaled in the trunk of the Renault Scenic vehicle, hired by the McCanns weeks after the disappearance, and even on Madeleine's favorite soft toy, Cuddle Cat. While the specifics of the alerts are striking, what matters more is how these alerts were handled. In a case where almost all other physical evidence was lacking, these reactions offered an investigative path worth exploring with seriousness. Yet, the response from British authorities was markedly restrained. Scotland Yard, in particular, downplayed the relevance of the dog's findings. The justification: the reactions were deemed not admissible on their own, and the DNA recovered was considered inconclusive due to mixed samples. This response stands in sharp contrast to how similar evidence was handled in the case of Chris Watts in the United States. In 2018, cadaver dogs detected signs of decomposition in Watts' garage and vehicle. Their alerts played a key role in shifting the direction of the investigation. Law enforcement escalated their approach, confronted inconsistencies in Watts' statements, and within days, secured a confession. The dogs were not the final proof, but they were the beginning of a truth no one wanted to believe. Why then, in the McCann case, did those same tools lead nowhere? One could argue that legal systems differ. That in the UK, the threshold for evidentiary action is higher. That DNA must meet standards of purity, and that canine reactions, while respected, require corroboration. But those arguments become thinner when viewed in context. The reactions weren't isolated. They spanned multiple locations and involved both cadaver and blood detection. If the same indicators had occurred in a different case, one without international media management, government involvement, and emotional investment, would they have been taken more seriously? Perhaps the most disquieting aspect is the presence of scent on Cuddle Cat, Madeleine's favorite toy. Her mother, Kate McCann, was often seen clinging to this stuffed animal during interviews and public appearances. The object became a symbol of maternal grief, a bridge between mother and missing daughter. Yet the fact that the cadaver dog alerted on this very item changes its meaning entirely. It suggests physical proximity to a deceased body, something no parent would unknowingly hold close if unaware of such exposure. Equally troubling is the reaction in the trunk of the McCann's rented car. By the time the dogs conducted their search, this vehicle had been in use for weeks. If Madeleine had truly been abducted and never returned, how could any trace of her, especially death-related scent, have been present there? While the DNA sample found was not declared definitive in court terms, its partial match to Madeleine raises profound questions. And yet, rather than prompting further inquiry into the possibility of internal involvement, the investigation diverted entirely. Operation Grange, the British review of the case launched in 2011, explicitly framed its approach around the abduction theory. No official reinvestigation into alternative scenarios, particularly those involving the McCanns themselves, was ever initiated, despite the indicators provided by the dogs. Instead, the public was left with vague statements. Cadaver dog reactions are not legal evidence, and the DNA was mixed. These may be technically true, but technical truths can also be used to obscure inconvenient realities. What was never provided was a thorough explanation. Why were these findings not enough to pursue deeper questioning? Why were the alerts not publicly scrutinized with the same intensity given to Madeleine's last known sightings? More importantly, why did the media, which had so willingly amplified the family's pain and the call for justice, show so little interest in the forensic anomalies? The same outlets that reported the dog's involvement rarely followed up with analysis or pressure. Instead, the conversation shifted back to external threats: prowlers, predators, lone abductors. The narrative was reset, and thus emerged one of the most enduring questions in the Madeleine McCann case. Is it possible that the dogs told us a version of the truth no one wanted to confront? Because dogs do not lie. They do not fabricate evidence. Their reactions are not shaped by media, political consequences, or public pressure. Their purpose is binary: react or don't react. And in this case, they reacted in multiple places, on multiple objects, in a pattern that suggests death, concealment, and movement. The failure to act decisively on these signals cannot be attributed to investigative caution alone. It reflects a deeper reluctance, an institutional unwillingness to acknowledge a reality that may have implicated the very people the world had been taught to see as victims. To this day, no legal body has officially discredited the dogs' alerts. They simply chose not to follow them. That is the most haunting part of all. The public was not told the full story, not because the truth wasn't there, but because it was too dangerous to speak aloud. The signals were received, but the meaning was denied. In the end, it wasn't science that failed. It wasn't the dogs. It was people who decided which truths the world could handle, and which needed to be buried deeper than any scent could reach. And so the phrase echoes like a warning in the silence: dogs don't lie. Only people do. One of the most enduring enigmas in the Madeleine McCann case is not just the disappearance itself, but the impenetrable silence maintained by the group of adults who were with the McCanns on the night she vanished. Known widely as the TAPAS 7, this group, consisting primarily of medical professionals, dined with Kate and Jerry McCann on the evening of May 3, 2007, at the Tapas restaurant near apartment 5A. For over 16 years, not a single member of this group has broken ranks. Not one has contradicted the others. Not one has leaked a different version of events, either publicly or anonymously. In a world where human memory is fallible and group loyalty is fragile, this complete consistency has raised red flags that demand closer examination. Each member of the Tapas 7 was interviewed separately by authorities. Despite being questioned under pressure, their statements aligned with remarkable uniformity. All of them recalled a rotation system, in which members took turns checking on their children, who were asleep in nearby apartments. The version of events they presented was nearly identical down to the frequency of checks and the order of who went when. While consistency in memory may seem reassuring at first glance, investigators and behavioral analysts have noted that in high-stress, real-life scenarios, discrepancies are not only expected but natural. Small variances in timelines, perception, and detail are part of how authentic human memory functions. The fact that 7 adults, with no legal obligation to one another maintained synchronized accounts for over a decade through police interviews, media inquiries, and public scrutiny is, quite simply, abnormal. Equally suspicious is the content and execution of the child-checking timeline itself. According to the group, a system had been agreed upon where each adult would leave the table at 15 to 30-minute intervals to check on their children. However, closer analysis of the statements reveals significant inconsistencies. Some checks were described as merely listening at the door or glancing in briefly hardly thorough, protective behaviors. In the case of Madeleine specifically, there is no confirmed report of any adult physically seeing all 3 children asleep in the room after 8:30 p.m., except for Kate's final visit when she discovered Madeleine missing. When investigators tried to reconstruct the sequence of checks, time-stamped sightings, and movements between apartments, the timeline revealed overlapping entries, logical contradictions, and insufficient time gaps. In particular, the intervals did not seem to account realistically for walking distances and interactions. This has led some analysts to suggest that the timeline might have been pre-agreed. After the fact, synchronized post-crisis to avoid discrepancies or suspicion. If that is true, it implies that the TAPAS 7 collectively rehearsed or tailored their accounts, not necessarily to deceive outright, but to shield themselves from further entanglement in a spiraling investigation. One figure in the group has drawn particular attention: Dr. David Payne, a close friend of the McCanns, and the last known person besides Kate and Jerry to have allegedly seen Madeleine alive. Payne's presence in the timeline is critical. More alarmingly, a woman named Catherine, also known to the McCanns, gave a statement asserting that Payne once made inappropriate remarks and gestures while referencing Madeleine. She described the conversation as deeply unsettling, even saying it gave her the creeps. Her statement was documented and forwarded to authorities, yet no formal investigation into Payne was ever initiated by British police. The silence surrounding this allegation, particularly in a case where every other angle was exhausted, raises serious concerns about internal protection or deliberate omission. The broader question is, why would such a highly educated, socially independent group of individuals maintain absolute silence, even in the face of potential criminal liability or moral dilemma? Theories abound, but 2 dominate. The first is the loyalty pact hypothesis. This suggests that the TAPAS 7, bound by long-standing friendships, shared professions, and social trust, chose to close ranks. The reasoning may not be nefarious. If something accidental happened that night, a fall, an overdose, or a cover-up gone wrong, the group may have chosen solidarity over the legal risks of full disclosure. Protecting the McCanns could also have meant protecting themselves from collateral damage, particularly if any of their actions or inactions contributed to Madeleine's disappearance. The second theory is more ominous: the possibility of a blackmail pact. In this scenario, one or more members of the group may be withholding the truth not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Whether the fear stems from reputational ruin, professional destruction, or deeper secrets is unknown, but in tightly knit circles of influence, the threat of exposure can be paralyzing. For medical professionals, in particular, losing one's license is tantamount to losing one's identity. The incentive to protect that standing could be strong enough to override ethical instincts, even in the wake of tragedy. Regardless of the motivation, the result is the same: an unbroken wall of silence. This cohesion has withstood police interrogations, international media storms, civil lawsuits, and years of public debate. Not one defector, not one whistleblower, no anonymous letter, no post-retirement confession, not even a misstep in a documentary or interview. Behavioral psychologists often speak of group truth versus objective truth. In the TAPAS 7, we see a textbook case of group truth, a version of events that serves the collective, repeated often enough to harden into internal belief. Whether this version is real or constructed, no outsider can say for sure, but the consistency itself, the lack of deviation over time, is unnatural. It is worth noting that this silence persists, despite the absence of legal obligation. The TAPAS 7 were not under oath when speaking to the press. They were not bound by non-disclosure agreements. None of them were arrested or charged. In theory, they had every freedom to speak their minds. And yet, they did not. This leads us to one of the most chilling questions surrounding the Madeleine McCann case. If something went wrong that night, and if the truth was indeed known within that circle, what kind of pressure, influence, or internal understanding could compel such a sophisticated group of people to maintain complete silence for nearly 2 decades? The human conscience is rarely so cooperative. Guilt leaks. Secrets wear down resolve. But here, nothing leaked, nothing cracked. The silence feels less like absence of knowledge and more like the presence of control. And in that silence, perhaps, lies the real story. When a 3-year-old child goes missing, forensic investigators rely on more than just witness statements. They rely on the science left behind DNA, fingerprints, biological residue fibers. Especially in a case where abduction is alleged, the child's sleeping area becomes critical. That was the case with apartment 5EA at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, Portugal, the place where Madeleine McCann was last seen. But here's the unsettling truth. Forensic specialists found no conclusive DNA of Madeleine in her own bed. No hairs, no saliva stains, no epithelial cells on the pillow or sheets. Nothing that definitively proved she had slept there the night she vanished. And for any child, especially one just 3 years old, that absence isn't just strange. It defies forensic expectations. Children, by nature, are biological evidence machines. They shed hair, drool during sleep, leave behind skin flakes, food stains, even urine or sweat residues. These are ordinary and expected. Yet in Madeleine's case, the forensic vacuum was striking. The mattress, bedding, and surrounding walls yielded no clear biological trace attributed solely to her. That, in itself, raised questions. Had she actually slept there that night? Or, more disturbingly, had that area been deliberately scrubbed? Investigators were immediately confronted with a puzzle. If this was truly a scene of abduction, why did it lack the chaos, mess, and residual DNA usually present in such cases? Why was Madeleine's supposed sleeping space so pristine? Compounding the mystery was a seemingly innocuous object, a soft toy named Cuddle Cat. This was Madeleine's favorite stuffed animal, often photographed in the arms of Kate McCann during press appearances. To the public, it symbolized grief, innocence, and maternal devotion. But to the trained nose of cadaver dog Eddie, it signaled something else entirely. When deployed in the apartment, Eddie reacted strongly to Cuddle Cat. His alert suggested that the toy had been in contact with human decomposition. Not only did this raise questions about where the toy had been, it also cast doubt on the image being projected to the public. If the toy was contaminated with cadaver scent, why would Kate McCann continue to carry it around in front of cameras? Even more troubling, the location of this scent detection wasn't random. The strongest alert from the cadaver dog in the apartment occurred near the living room sofa, the same area where Cuddle Cat was later photographed lying. This suggests the toy and that location may have shared a disturbing point of contact, a deceased body. Perhaps the most perplexing discovery came weeks later, when investigators turned their attention to the rental car obtained by the McCanns, a Renault Scenic hired nearly 3 weeks after Madeleine disappeared. Once again, cadaver dog Eddie alerted to the trunk of the vehicle, and blood detection dog Keela picked up the presence of bodily fluid traces in the same area. Forensic testing would later confirm a partial DNA match with Madeleine, though the results were deemed inconclusive by British authorities due to sample degradation and mixture with other profiles. Still, the implications were staggering. If Madeleine had been abducted on May 3, how could her biological material, particularly cadaver scent and partial DNA, have ended up in a car that wasn't rented until weeks later? The answer leads to one chilling hypothesis. She may not have been abducted at all. She may have died before the car was even in their possession. And if true, someone moved her body after the fact. But even more critical is this: while the car trunk, a location remote from the original scene, contained forensic traces linked to Madeleine, Her own bed did not. How can that discrepancy be explained? Some experts in forensic science argue that the absence of DNA is not evidence of absence. It may simply indicate that a scene was altered. In high-profile criminal cases, especially those involving public figures or media-savvy suspects, there is sometimes an attempt to clean or stage a scene. This theory gained traction among observers who noted how thoroughly Madeleine's bedroom appeared to have been wiped down. Not only was her DNA missing, but there was no sign of disturbance, no forced entry, and no credible witness to any abduction in progress. Such forensic sterility can be explained by one of two scenarios. The first, a highly skilled, surgical-style abduction with zero physical disturbance, a feat unlikely to occur in real life, especially involving a 3-year-old in a small apartment with neighbors and siblings nearby. The second, the area was cleaned after an internal incident, with time and intent devoted to erasing evidence. In this context, the lack of biological trace becomes more damning than presence. The absence of DNA was not the only abnormality. The broader context of the night further undermines the kidnapping theory. There were no signs of forced entry. The shutters of the children's room were intact, and investigators concluded they had not been tampered with from outside. There were no fingerprints from intruders. There was no sign of struggle. No neighbors reported hearing screams, thuds, or footsteps during the critical window of time, and yet within this atmosphere of eerie calm a child allegedly vanished. If someone entered the apartment, snatched Madeleine, and escaped without making a sound, leaving no trace, they achieved something close to a forensic miracle. The problem is, such miracles don't happen often. Especially not in the real world. Taken as isolated elements, each of these findings could be explained away: a flawed forensic team, poor sample collection, or a contaminated crime scene. But taken together, the missing DNA, the cadaver scent in the living room, the positive detection in the car, and the pristine bedroom, they suggest something else: orchestration. The hypothesis is unsettling. That Madeleine may have died in the apartment, and what we're seeing is not a crime scene frozen in time, but one meticulously reset. If true, that changes the entire framework of the investigation. Suddenly, this isn't the site of an abduction, it's the site of post-incident damage control. 16 years later, the forensic silence inside apartment 5A continues to speak loudly. It asks why a child's bedroom lacked the biological fingerprints of the child herself. It asks how a stuffed animal, carried by a grieving mother, came to carry the scent of death. It asks why forensic results pointing to decomposition were accepted in one high-profile case like Chris Watts but dismissed in another. It also asks what was truly being protected in those early days: the truth or the narrative. Because when a child disappears, we search for what's missing. But sometimes, what's missing is the very thing that reveals what happened. In the years following Madeleine McCann's disappearance, the story that unfolded in public was shaped less by evidence and more by silence: strategic, orchestrated, and impenetrable. Beneath the noise of media coverage, fundraising campaigns, and televised grief, one figure in particular disappeared, not just from the narrative, but from public life altogether: David Payne. David Payne was not a minor character in the case. As a close friend of the McCanns and a central member of the TAPAS 7, the group of British holidaymakers dining with Kate and Jerry McCann the night Madeleine vanished, he was reportedly the last non-parent to see Madeleine alive. That alone should have warranted deep scrutiny. But there was more. Catherine Gaspar, a friend of the McCann family and a trained medical professional, gave a detailed statement alleging that Payne once made disturbing gestures during a conversation about Madeleine, gestures that struck her as overtly inappropriate and deeply unsettling. Her discomfort was so profound that she later submitted a signed affidavit detailing the incident. Despite this, British police never opened a formal investigation into David Payne. There was no questioning in the public record, no media interrogation, no follow-up. And since 2007, Payne has all but vanished from public view. He has not appeared in interviews, press conferences, or even background commentary, an unusual absence for someone so intimately connected to one of the most high-profile child disappearances of the 21st century. His disappearance from the media landscape only deepens the suspicion surrounding his role and raises a chilling question: was his silence his own, or someone else's strategy? While Payne disappeared, the McCanns themselves pursued a different path. 4 years after Madeleine's disappearance, in 2011, Kate McCann published a memoir titled Madeleine. Timed to coincide with the anniversary of her daughter's vanishing, the book was widely promoted and rapidly became a commercial success. It reaffirmed the abduction theory with emotional force and positioned the McCanns firmly as victims of an unimaginable tragedy. The book's message was clear: someone else took Madeleine, and any suggestion to the contrary was an attack on grieving parents. The McCanns' media presence was unrelenting. With the help of high-powered PR consultants, some with ties to the British government, they appeared on major networks. Every appearance reinforced the same narrative. The campaign, Find Madeleine, was not just a search, it was a brand. Behind the scenes, every statement, every photo, and every appeal was tightly controlled and curated to maintain a consistent image of innocence and victimhood. Yet, not all voices were welcomed in this media campaign. Portuguese investigator Gonçalo Amaral, who had once led the case, published a book outlining his belief that Madeleine died in the apartment and that the abduction story was a cover-up. The McCanns sued him, accusing him of defamation. They won an initial verdict, though it was later overturned. Regardless of the legal outcome, the message was unmistakable: deviation from the official narrative was dangerous professionally, financially, and socially. Meanwhile, the Find Madeleine Fund, established within days of the disappearance, became a multi-million-pound operation. It received generous donations from the public and from celebrities such as Richard Branson and J.K. Rowling. By all accounts, the fund had a noble purpose: to find a missing child. But over the years, concerns about transparency emerged. Whistleblowers and critics claimed that the money was being used not just for search operations, but also to pay PR firms, cover personal expenses, and fund legal battles. Annual financial reports were often vague or incomplete, and forensic accountants questioned the lack of oversight for such a high-profile campaign. These issues might have faded into the background, if not for one stubborn truth: as time passed, the questions around Madeleine's disappearance only grew sharper. Forensic sniffer dogs, one trained to detect human blood. The other cadaver scent, reacted strongly in multiple areas of the McCanns' holiday apartment and in their rented car. DNA evidence found in the car trunk partially matched Madeleine's. Yet, rather than being treated as critical leads, these findings were downplayed or dismissed altogether by British authorities. Scotland Yard declared that the evidence lacked legal weight, citing inconclusive DNA and the fallibility of canine detection. But critics pointed to other cases like that of Chris Watts in the US, where the same type of dog alerts were key to solving crimes. Then there was the silence of the TAPAS 7. Not one of them, not even after a decade and a half, ever contradicted the original version of events. Their timelines remained synchronized, their testimonies harmonious. No leaks, no deathbed confessions, no anonymous tips. In any large group, especially one with no formal obligations to each other, such uniformity is not just rare, it is statistically improbable. Was it loyalty, legal advice, or fear of consequences if someone broke ranks? Equally troubling was the lack of physical evidence in the apartment itself. Despite being the room where a 3-year-old supposedly slept, forensic teams found no definitive traces of Madeleine's DNA near her bed: no hair, no saliva, no epithelial cells. Yet her favorite toy, CUDDLE cat, carried the scent of a dead body, according to cadaver dog Eddie. That toy had been repeatedly seen in Kate McCann's arms during press appearances. Its presence, juxtaposed with the absence of other forensic traces, suggested not a chaotic kidnapping, but the possibility of a deliberately cleaned crime scene. Still, the media stuck to the abduction script. Each year, as anniversaries passed, the story was revived: new age progression images, fresh appeals, and vague updates from Operation Grange, the UK's multi-million-pound investigative task force. Rarely were the inconsistencies revisited. Rarely were dissenting theories allowed airtime. The possibility of parental involvement was not just discouraged, it was treated as slander. And so, the questions linger. Why did David Payne disappear from public view? Why did a book get published, a brand get built, and a fund amass millions before the most basic inconsistencies were addressed? Why were forensic findings quietly buried beneath press releases and polished interviews? Why did the TAPAS 7 speak in unison and never again? Perhaps the most haunting truth of all is that in the face of doubt, power often prevails. As one commentator noted with grim clarity, when truth is not heard, those in power will tell the story they choose. And in the case of Madeleine McCann, the story chosen has left a trail not of answers but of silence. But beyond the silence, beyond the courtroom battles and orchestrated narratives, the Madeleine McCann case leaves behind 3 chilling lessons, ones that echo far beyond Praia da Luz. First, the integrity of a crime scene must never be compromised, no matter how frantic or emotionally charged the moment. In this case, the apartment where Madeleine was last seen, apartment 5A, was entered by multiple people, friends, hotel staff, and even the parents themselves. There were no police cordons, no protected evidence, and no recorded movements in the first critical hours. Forensics later struggled to reconstruct a reliable timeline, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because it had been disturbed beyond retrieval. In missing child investigations, especially those involving toddlers, even the smallest trace hair, a footprint, a saliva smear can hold immense value. Preserving the original environment should always come before assumptions, panic, or emotion. Second, total narrative unity in a group of educated adults, especially under extreme stress, is not a sign of accuracy, but a red flag for coordination. The TAPAS 7 were physicians, scientists, and professionals, all of whom presented a nearly identical sequence of events that night. 16 years later, not one of them has deviated from that account. No contradictions. No clarifications. No human error. In forensic psychology, this phenomenon is known as collective narrative defense, a subconscious or intentional agreement among a group to maintain a shared version of events, often to protect reputations or avoid legal scrutiny. Truth is rarely seamless. Memory is never identical. When a story sounds too perfectly aligned, it may have been rehearsed. Third, when media control outpaces forensic evidence, truth becomes secondary to optics. The McCanns, aided by elite PR professionals with ties to government, were able to dominate the global narrative. Their portrayal as grieving parents became untouchable. Every dissenting voice, from journalists to investigators, was dismissed as conspiratorial or malicious. Meanwhile, cadaver dogs were alerting. DNA was surfacing. Eyewitness accounts were raising questions. But the dominant storyline prevailed: Madeleine was abducted. Nothing else was allowed space to breathe. These 3 truths about crime scenes, coordinated testimonies, and the weaponization of media have turned the Madeleine McCann case into something bigger than a missing child. They've turned it into a case study in how perception can replace evidence, how silence can be manufactured, and how justice can be outpaced by power. In the face of silence, uncertainty, and powerfully constructed narratives, it's easy to feel that the truth about what happened to Madeleine McCann may never fully emerge. But cases like this remind us of something deeper: our collective responsibility to keep asking questions, to remain vigilant, and to never let a story be sealed simply because it is inconvenient or uncomfortable. Time does not erase truth. It only buries it deeper, waiting for those with courage, clarity, and conscience to uncover it. The past is not fixed. New technology, fresh voices, and shifting tides of justice can bring buried facts back into the light. One breakthrough, one confession, one new perspective could change everything. For Madeleine, whose voice was taken before she had a chance to tell her story, we owe at least that much: a commitment to truth, however long it takes. A belief that justice is not about blame alone, but about giving voice to the voiceless. As long as there are those who still care, still look, and still dare to question, the story is not over. Maybe one day, silence will break. And when it does, the truth will speak.